She threw the letter into the fire before she finished reading it. Not because she didn't understand every word her father had written. She understood perfectly. She understood the way a woman understands a sentence she has read 100 times in 100 different forms, in the tightening grip of a man's hand around her wrist, in the locked door of a room she was told was her own, in the polite smiles of women who knew and said nothing. She burned it because if she kept it one more second, she would have folded it, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked herself back to the station. And some part of her, the oldest, most exhausted part, was still tempted to do exactly that. That was the morning Abigail Harper decided she was either going to live the rest of her life on her own terms or not live it at all. If you've ever felt trapped in someone else's idea of who you're supposed to be, if you've ever stood at a crossroads and didn't know whether you had the courage to choose, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next in Red Canyon, Nevada, changes everything. The train from Boston arrived 40 minutes late, which gave the people of Red Canyon just enough time to gather at the platform and remind each other in the particular way that small towns do exactly what they thought about a man who ordered himself a bride through the mail. Cole Mercer stood apart from the crowd, the way he always stood, shoulders back, hat low, arms loose at his sides, the posture of a man who had learned early that the less space you seemed to take up, the more carefully people underestimated you. He was 34 years old, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that had stopped being young-looking around the time he was 20, and hadn't changed much since. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and a scar along his jaw from a fence wire that had snapped back on him 6 years ago on a winter morning he still didn't like thinking about. He was not a man who inspired poetry. He was a man who inspired trust, which was rarer. He had the letter in his breast pocket. He'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Abigail Harper, it said. 22 years of age. Educated. Capable. Accustomed to hard work. Looking for a fresh start in the West. He had written back 7 times over 10 months. She had written back 6. He had kept every one. The whistle sounded. "Cole Mercer's mail-order bride," said a voice somewhere behind him, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough for the speaker to pretend otherwise. Wonder if she knows what she's getting into. Cole didn't turn around. The train slowed. Steam poured across the platform like a curtain being drawn, and then it cleared, and the doors opened, and people began to step down. A cattle buyer Cole recognized 2 men in suits. He didn't a family with 3 young children who looked dazed from the journey. And then she stepped down, and Cole understood immediately why people were going to say what they were going to say. She was small. That was the first thing. Small in a way that had nothing to do with height. She was average height, maybe a fraction below, but slight, almost fragile-looking, with dark circles pressed deep beneath her eyes and cheekbones that stood out too sharply under pale skin. She was wearing a gray traveling dress that fit her badly, a size too large at the shoulders, and she carried a single worn suitcase that she held with both hands against her body like a shield. Her hair was dark, pinned up neatly, but coming loose at the temples, and she was scanning the platform with the particular expression of a person who is trying very hard to appear calm while being profoundly afraid. She looked. Cole thought with a slow sinking in his chest, like someone who had not slept in several days and had not eaten much in longer than that. She did not look like a woman running toward something. She looked like a woman running away. The whisper started before she'd taken 3 steps. "Lord, she's just a girl." "How old is she? Do you think 17, 18? Cole Mercer ought to be ashamed of himself. He heard all of it. He watched her hear all of it too, the slight flinch around her eyes, the way her chin lifted a fraction in response. The small, fierce dignity of a woman who had learned to take public humiliation without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land. He recognized that particular brand of composure. He'd seen it in animals caught in traps, the ones that went very still and very quiet, because making noise only made things worse. He crossed the platform. She saw him coming and went still in exactly that way. He stopped 2 feet from her, took his hat off, held it at his side. "Miss Harper," he said, "I'm Cole Mercer." She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark brown, and there was something in them, not fear exactly, though the fear was there too, something more like wariness. The wariness of a person who has been told too many times that what's happening is for their own good. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steadier than he'd expected. "You had a long journey." "I did." "You hungry?" Something shifted in her face. Such a small shift, just the faintest softening around the mouth, that he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. "Yes," she said. "I am. There's a place on Main Street. Good food, quiet corner. Nobody'll bother us." He paused. "And I want to say something first before we go anywhere, if that's all right." She waited. "I know what people are saying back there," he said. "I don't care what they're saying. I want to be clear about something, Miss Harper. I'm not the kind of man who makes a woman feel like she owes him anything for being decent to her. So whatever you heard about me, whatever you expected, I want you to start from scratch. You don't owe me a thing. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, unless you decide on your own that you want to." She stared at him for a long moment. "That's a very fine speech, Mr. Mercer," she said. "It's not a speech. It's just true." Another pause. Something complicated moved through her expression. Skepticism, and underneath the skepticism, something fragile that might have been hope. "Then I suppose," she said carefully, "I'd very much like some supper." They walked off the platform together. Behind them, Red Canyon watched and whispered and drew its conclusions, and Cole didn't give a single one of those conclusions a moment of his attention. She hadn't come from nowhere. He'd understood that from the letters, or rather from the careful spaces between the things the letters said. A woman didn't leave Boston, and everything she'd ever known to answer a newspaper advertisement from a Nevada rancher without a reason. Cole was not a naive man. He hadn't expected her story to be simple. What he hadn't expected was quite how complicated it was going to turn out to be. She told him some of it over supper haltingly at first. Then with increasing steadiness, the way water finds the cracks in a wall. It's been pressing against for a long time. Her father was a businessman in Boston, she said. He had made money and lost money and made it again. And through all of it, he had treated his wife and daughters like assets on a ledger sheet. Things with value that could be leveraged. He arranged a marriage, she said, when I was 19. A man named Gerald Fitch, who was 51 years old, and had already buried one wife and driven off 2 others. Father said it was a good match. Father said Mr. Fitch was respected and comfortable, and that I was lucky. She looked down at her plate. I told Father I wouldn't do it. He told me I didn't have a choice. I spent 3 years telling him I wouldn't do it. And then, Cole said, and then I found the advertisement. She met his eyes. I know what you're thinking. What am I thinking? That I was desperate, that I would have gone anywhere just to get away from him. Cole was quiet for a moment. Was I wrong? She didn't answer right away, which he respected. She was not the kind of woman who gave you easy answers to make the conversation comfortable. Partly, she said at last, but only partly. I read your letters, Mr. Mercer, all of them. You write like a person who tells the truth even when it isn't flattering to themselves. You told me the ranch was struggling. You told me the winters were brutal. You told me you couldn't promise me anything except honesty and hard work. Most men advertising for wives promise everything under the sun. She paused. You promised very little. I found that more reassuring than any promise. He looked at her across the table. This thin, exhausted, careful woman who had burned through 3 years of her life, saying no to a man who wouldn't hear it, and who had shown up on his train platform with 1 suitcase and enough wariness to fill a canyon, and he felt something he didn't quite have a name for. Not quite attraction, though. That was there, too, in the uncomplicated way that honesty in a person always drew him. Something more like recognition. Well, he said, the ranch is still struggling. The winters are still brutal. A small, involuntary smile crossed her face, just for a moment, gone almost before it arrived. Good, she said. I prefer to know what I'm walking into. The room Cole had prepared for her was at the far end of the ranch house, separated from his own by the kitchen and the main room. It had a window that faced east, a quilt his mother had made 20 years ago, a small writing desk, and a lock on the door. A real lock with a key, which he pressed into her hand the morning after her arrival without explanation or ceremony. She looked at the key. "The lock works from the inside," he said. "The key is yours. I don't have a copy." She looked at him with that careful measuring gaze. "Most men," she said slowly, "wouldn't think to do that. Most men," he said, "aren't trying to be most men." He left her to settle in. She did not come out of that room for the better part of 2 days. He left meals outside the door, nothing elaborate, just bread and beans and coffee, and didn't knock, didn't call, didn't make her explain herself. On the second evening, he heard movement, and then the door opened, and she stood in the doorway, looking less like someone who'd been running, and a little more like someone who'd been sleeping. "I apologize," she said. "For what? For disappearing. It wasn't—" She stopped, seemed to search for the words. "I needed some time before I could be a person again." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense. You're not angry." "Should I be?" She blinked. "My father would have been furious." "I'm not your father." She stood there looking at him for a moment. This man in the doorway of his own kitchen, with flour on his shirt, from a biscuit attempt that had not gone particularly well, and something shifted in her expression. Something careful and closed began very slightly to open. "No," she said quietly. "You're not." The town did not stop watching them. Red Canyon in 1888 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and considered this a public service rather than a failing. The women especially, not out of malice exactly, but out of the particular anxious attention that small communities pay to anything that breaks a rule they've agreed upon without quite naming it. Abigail was too young. Abigail was suspicious. Abigail had come from somewhere else, and nobody knew quite why, which in Red Canyon was practically a criminal offense. She met them the way she'd been meeting difficult people all her life, with composure and precision, and a complete refusal to explain herself to anyone who hadn't earned the right to an explanation. Martha Kellison, who ran the dry goods store and had an opinion about everything that had ever happened in the county since 1852, stopped her on the street in the second week. "Miss Harper," she said with that particular sweetness that is the exact shape of a question that isn't really a question, "you must find it very quiet out here after Boston." "I find it restful," Abigail said pleasantly. "And Mr. Mercer, he's treating you well." "Very well, thank you. It's just—" Martha tilted her head, studying her. "You seem very young, dear. And Cole is, well, he's a grown man with a grown man's needs and expectations. It must be a great deal of pressure." Abigail looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Kellison," she said, "how long have you lived in Red Canyon?" Martha blinked, surprised. "Why, 30 years, I suppose." "And in 30 years has Cole Mercer ever given you any reason to think poorly of his character?" A pause. "Well, no, not as such." "Then perhaps," Abigail said, "the assumption you're currently making says more about other men than it does about him." She smiled, the polite, precise smile of a woman who has had this particular kind of conversation far too many times. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Kellison." She walked away. Martha Kellison stood on the sidewalk watching her go, with an expression that was half offense and half, though she would never have admitted it, respect. Cole heard about the exchange from 3 different people before noon. He didn't say anything about it when she came back to the ranch that evening. He just set a cup of coffee in front of her and sat across the table and waited while she sorted through the supplies she'd brought from town. "I heard," he said eventually, "that you gave Martha Kellison something to think about." "Martha Kellison was implying that you were a predator," Abigail said crisply, not looking up from the flour she was measuring. "I found it irritating. You didn't have to defend me. I know I didn't have to." She looked up then. "I wanted to. There's a difference." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had arrived on his platform like something the storm had thrown up, worn down to the bone, wary as a cat carrying so much quiet damage that he'd half expected her to bolt within the first week, and he thought, there she is. There's the person she actually is, underneath all of it. He didn't say any of that. He said thank you. She nodded matter-of-fact and went back to her measuring. But something in the room had shifted. Something small and significant the way the light changes when a cloud moves. It was Frank Delaney who finally put into words what the rest of the town had been circling around. Frank ran the feed store and fancied himself a man of plain speaking, which was another way of saying he had never learned to tell the difference between honesty and cruelty. He cornered Cole outside the livery on a Tuesday morning in late October. "I'll say it straight, Cole," he said, jamming his thumbs in his belt. "People are talking. That girl you brought home, she can't be more than 17, 18 years old, looks half-starved. Nobody knows where she came from or why she left. You've had her out at your ranch for 6 weeks, and you ain't had a wedding. Now what exactly are your intentions?" Cole looked at him for a moment. "Frank," he said, "I've known you 17 years. "That's right. And in 17 years have I ever done anything that wasn't above board?" Frank shifted. "Well, no. But she's 22 years old, she's educated, she came from Boston. She left because her father was trying to force her into a marriage she didn't want." Cole's voice was flat and even the way it got when he was working hard at keeping it that way. "And as for when we get married, that's between her and me, and it'll happen when she's ready and not 1 minute before." Frank stared at him. "A man can't just wait forever on a woman's convenience." "Can't he?" "It ain't natural." Cole picked up the feed he'd come for. "You know what I think, Frank? I think a man who can't wait for a woman to be ready probably ought to be real honest with himself about why that is." He looked at him once steady and level. "And I think this conversation is over." He walked away. Behind him, Frank Delaney had the particular expression of a man who has been told something he will be angry about for several days because it is uncomfortably true. Cole didn't tell Abigail about that conversation either, but she found out the way she found out most things in Red Canyon, through the complicated network of information that moves through a small town like water through sand. She came to him that evening while he was working in the barn, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her eyes bright. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He kept working. "Do what? Defend me, to Frank Delaney or anyone else?" "I wasn't defending you." He glanced up. "I was defending what's right. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "You said it'll happen when I'm ready," she said. There was something careful in her voice, like she was carrying the words gently, not quite sure of the ground beneath them. "Did you mean that—" He set down what he was doing, turned to face her. "Miss Harper," he said, "I mean everything I say. I don't see much point in saying things you don't mean. And if I'm never ready—" He held her gaze. "Then I reckon we'd have to figure out what that looks like. But I'm not going to push you into something you don't want just because people are making noise." He paused. "That's not what I brought you here for." "Why did you bring me here?" It was a direct question. She asked it directly, which he appreciated and which meant she deserved a direct answer. "Because your letters told me you were someone worth knowing," he said, "and I was right. The rest of it can wait." She stood in the doorway of that barn for a long time, looking at him with that careful, measuring gaze that he'd come to recognize as the expression she wore when she was trying to decide whether something was real. He waited. He was good at waiting. "All right," she said at last quietly. "All right." She didn't explain what she meant by it, and he didn't ask. He just nodded and went back to work, and she stood there a little while longer before she turned and walked back toward the house. He watched her go. He thought, be patient. Be steady. Don't push, don't rush, don't take a single inch she hasn't offered freely. He thought if trust takes time, then time is what she'll have. He didn't know yet what she was still keeping from him. He didn't know about the letter. He didn't know that the past she'd run from was not done running after her. He didn't know that before the winter was through, Abigail Harper would be standing in his kitchen at midnight, shaking, holding a piece of paper that was about to blow everything she'd built to pieces. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was this: she was here. She was still here. And for tonight, that was enough. November came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that didn't ask permission before it settled into your bones and stayed there. Abigail had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and somewhere in the turning of October into November, something had shifted between her and Cole. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a river changes course slowly, persistently, and without announcing itself, until you looked back and realized the landscape was entirely different from what it had been. She had started helping with the books. It had begun almost by accident. Cole had left the ranch ledgers on the kitchen table one evening, a mess of numbers and crossed-out entries and margin notes that made very little sense to anyone who wasn't already inside Cole's head. And Abigail had sat down with a cup of coffee and started reading through them, the way she read everything carefully with total attention, looking for the logic beneath the surface. When Cole came in from the barn an hour later, she had the ledger open and 3 pages of her own notes spread beside it. "You've been overcharged for feed every quarter for the past 2 years," she said without looking up. "By the same supplier, the same line item, slightly different amounts each time. Small enough that it looks like variance. It isn't." Cole stood in the doorway, still in his coat. "Delaney's," she said. "Your feed supplier." Cole was very still. "Frank Delaney." "The same." She looked up then. "I don't think it's an accident." Cole pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. He looked at the ledger, at her notes, at the careful column of figures she'd laid out, showing the pattern across 8 quarters. "How much?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's nearly a full season's worth of income," he said. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've known Frank Delaney since I was 19 years old." "I know." Her voice was even, not unkind. "That's probably why he thought you wouldn't look too closely." Cole looked at her across the table, at this woman who had been in his house for 8 weeks, who had arrived with 1 suitcase and a wall of wariness, and a past she hadn't fully told him yet, and he felt something complicated move through him. Gratitude, yes, but also something that sat next to gratitude and was heavier and warmer and harder to name. "I'll go see him tomorrow," Cole said. "I can come with you," she said immediately. "If you want someone who can walk him through the numbers." He looked at her. "You do that?" "You defended me to that man in front of half the town," she said. "I reckon I can sit across a table from him with a ledger." Cole almost smiled. "Miss Harper," he said, "you keep surprising me." "Mr. Mercer," she said, going back to her notes. "I'm just getting started." The meeting with Frank Delaney the next morning was not comfortable for anyone. Cole laid the ledger on the counter of the feed store. Abigail laid her notes beside it. She walked Frank through every discrepancy with the calm, precise clarity of someone who had spent her whole life having to be twice as accurate as anyone expected, because the alternative was not being believed. Frank turned red. Then he turned white. Then he tried 3 different explanations, each of which Abigail dismantled quietly and without hesitation. "The numbers don't lie, Mr. Delaney," she said. "People do." Frank looked at Cole. "You're going to let a woman—" "I'm going to let the truth," Cole said, "do what it does." Frank repaid what he owed. Not cheerfully, not graciously, but he repaid it because the alternative was Abigail taking the ledger to the county sheriff, and Frank knew as well as anyone what that would look like. He never liked Abigail after that, but he never underestimated her again either. Neither did anyone else who heard the story, and in Red Canyon, everyone heard every story. It was Margaret Holt who changed things with the women. Margaret was the pastor's wife, not a woman who gossiped exactly, but a woman who moved information through the community the way a good river moves silt, quietly, constantly shaping everything it touched. She had watched Abigail from a careful distance since her arrival, and what she'd seen had given her a different opinion from the one the town had started with. She came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with a basket of preserves and a direct expression. "I'll be honest with you," she said, sitting at Abigail's kitchen table with her hands folded. "I came here expecting one thing and I'm leaving with another impression entirely. What did you expect? Abigail asked. Honestly, a frightened girl who didn't know what she'd gotten herself into. Margaret looked at her steadily. What I'm seeing is someone who knows exactly what she's doing and is doing it better than most. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Most people in this town are still waiting for me to prove I'm not a problem. Most people in this town, Margaret said dryly, have never left a 30-mile radius of where they were born. Their judgment on certain matters is limited. She paused. I'm on the school board. We're trying to start proper arithmetic lessons for the older children, and we have no one qualified to teach them. I understand you have a head for numbers. Abigail looked at her. Who told you that Frank Delaney, believe it or not, he was complaining about you to my husband? Margaret's expression was composed, but something glinted underneath it. He used words that were not polite, but the story he told made it very clear that you are precisely who we need. Abigail thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. When would you need me? She said. That was how she began teaching arithmetic to the children of Red Canyon 3 mornings a week in the back room of the church, which was the only space the school board had available. Within 2 weeks, she had 8 students. Within a month, she had 14. The children ranged in age from 8 to 15, and they were a difficult, squirming, resistant crowd, and she loved every minute of it. She had not expected to love it. That was the thing that caught her off guard. Not the teaching itself, but the discovery that she was capable of wanting something beyond survival. For 3 years in Boston, she had lived in a state of constant low-grade emergency, always calculating exits, always watching for the next pressure point. She had forgotten somewhere in the middle of all that she had things she actually wanted, things that were hers. The teaching was one. The bookkeeping was another. Word of what she'd done with Cole's ledgers spread the way everything spread in Red Canyon quickly and with embellishment. By December, 3 other ranchers had quietly asked if she'd be willing to look at their accounts. She charged them a fair rate, did the work at the kitchen table in the evenings, and sent the corrected ledgers back with handwritten notes explaining every change. Cole watched all of this with a particular kind of attention, not the possessive attention of a man watching a woman he owned, but the focused attention of someone watching something grow that he has the privilege of standing close to. He didn't say much about it. He wasn't a man who said much about things that mattered to him. But one evening in December, when she came in from delivering a finished ledger to the Henderson Ranch and sat down at the table, looking tired and pleased in equal measure, he set a cup of coffee in front of her and said, "You know what you're building out here?" She looked up. "What am I building?" "A life," he said simply. "A real one. That belongs to you." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression that she didn't let fully arrive. "I had a life in Boston," she said. "That was your father's life," Cole said, "that you happened to be living inside of." She was very quiet. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know." He sat down across from her and drank his coffee and didn't push, and she sat there in the warmth of that kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, or perhaps longer than that, perhaps ever, something that felt dangerously, precariously like peace. That was when she should have told him about the letter. She knew it even then. She could feel the secret like a weight behind her sternum pressing. She didn't tell him. Not yet. The first crisis came in January, and it had nothing to do with Abigail's past. It came from the land itself, from the irrigation channel on the north side of the ranch that had been struggling since autumn, and finally on a frozen Tuesday morning gave up entirely. Cole discovered it at dawn. The main channel had cracked along a 30-foot section, and the secondary channel was blocked with ice and debris. Without irrigation, the early crops he'd planned for March were finished. Without the March crops, cash flow through spring would be dangerously thin. He came in from the cold with the expression of a man doing very hard arithmetic in his head. Abigail was already at the table with coffee. She looked at his face. "What happened?" he told her. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he had come to value more than he could easily articulate. Most people started offering solutions before they'd finished hearing the problem. She never did. When he finished, she said, "Show me the maps." The land maps. Of the channel layout. Show me what we're working with. He spread the maps on the table. She studied them for 15 minutes, asking questions about the slope gradient, about where the blockage was, exactly about the secondary channels, and whether they were viable if the main was repaired differently. He answered every question. She was taking notes. Cole watched her and felt the particular disorientation of a man who has spent his whole adult life solving problems alone and is suddenly not alone. "There's a way," she said at last. "Tell me, if you redirect the secondary channel here," she pointed on the map, "instead of trying to run it parallel, you create a natural pressure differential. The ice won't block it the same way, because the angle of approach is different. It'll take 2 weeks of work instead of 4, and it'll cost less." Cole looked at the map. He looked at where she was pointing. He followed the logic of it step by step and felt it land. "That works," he said slowly. "I know it works. I read about it in a civil engineering pamphlet last fall. I was going to mention it regardless. Your current layout has 3 structural inefficiencies, but now seems like the more pressing moment." Cole looked at her. "You read civil engineering pamphlets," he said. "I read everything," she said, as though this were entirely obvious. "Do you want to fix the channel, or would you prefer to be surprised by my reading habits?" He almost laughed. He hadn't almost laughed in a while. "Channel," he said. "Definitely the channel." They spent the next 2 weeks rebuilding it. Cole did the physical labor, the digging, the laying of new stone, the freezing early mornings with ice cracking under his boots, and Abigail managed the materials, the calculations, the coordination with the 2 ranch hands he'd hired for the project. She was on site every morning, her breath clouding in the cold, her notebooks full of measurements and adjustments, arguing cheerfully with the hands when their measurements were off and complimenting them specifically and genuinely when they weren't. By the end of the 2nd week, the channel was better than it had ever been. Henderson came by to see it and stood looking at the new layout with his hands in his pockets. "That's a clever redirect," he said. "Miss Harper's design," Cole said. Henderson glanced toward Abigail, who was explaining something to one of the ranch hands with a stick and a patch of dirt. He watched her for a moment. "Cole," he said, "you know what this town said when you brought her home." "I know what they said." "I was one of them," Henderson said. He paused. "I'm telling you because I think I was wrong." Cole looked at him. "I know you were wrong." Henderson nodded slowly. "She's something else." "Yeah," Cole said, watching her. "She is." It was the first night of February when the thing Abigail had been dreading finally walked through the door, not literally, but in the form of an envelope with a Boston postmark, which was the next worst thing. Cole brought it in with the rest of the mail. He set it on the table without comment. He saw her face change when she saw it, just briefly. Just for a moment, the way a flame changes when a window opens, and then her face was composed again, the careful composure she wore, like armor. "I'll be in the barn," he said. He left her alone with it. He didn't know what was in it. He had suspicions he wasn't a man who missed much, but he didn't ask, and he didn't hover, and he gave her the space she needed to deal with whatever it was. What was in it was worse than he'd imagined. Her father had found her. She'd known he would eventually. Red Canyon was small. The advertisement she'd answered had run in 3 regional papers, and her father was not a man who accepted the word no in any form from anyone, especially his own daughter. The letter was 6 pages long. She read every word. The first 2 pages were about disappointment. Her father was deeply, profoundly, personally disappointed in her selfishness, her ingratitude, her failure to understand what she owed to her family. The next 2 pages were about Gerald Fitch, who had waited, who was still waiting, who was apparently willing to overlook Abigail's behavior if she returned within 60 days and fulfilled the arrangement. The last 2 pages were about what would happen if she didn't. Her father had connections. He knew people who knew people. He had already been in contact with certain parties who had confirmed that mail-order brides who abandoned their contracted arrangements could face legal consequences in several territories, and while Nevada might be a different story, The journey home could be arranged in ways that were... Abigail stopped reading at that page. She sat for a long time in the lamplight. Then she folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the bottom of her trunk under the winter blankets. Then she sat back down at the table and stared at nothing for a while. She did not go to Cole. She did not tell him. She sat with the weight of it alone, the way she had sat with difficult things alone for her entire life, because that was what she had learned to do. Because asking for help had never in her experience produced anything except more obligations. She told herself she would handle it. She told herself she had time. She told herself she was fine. For 3 weeks, she almost believed it. But here is what happened in those 3 weeks. She started pulling back, slightly carefully in ways that were easy to miss unless you were paying close attention. She was a little quieter at meals, a little more formal. She smiled less. She asked fewer questions. She stopped sitting by the fire in the evenings. Cole noticed immediately. He didn't say anything for the first week. He watched and waited and gave her room because he understood by now that pushing Abigail Harper towards something she wasn't ready to share was the fastest way to ensure she never shared it. But by the second week, the distance had become something he couldn't ignore. Not because it hurt him, though it did in the quiet, uncomplaining way that losses hurt people who have learned not to make noise about pain, but because he knew that whatever was eating at her was something she was carrying alone when she didn't have to. He waited for the right moment. It came on a Thursday evening in late February when she came in from town looking like someone who had been holding something extremely heavy for a very long time and was not sure she could keep holding it. He set coffee on the table. He sat down. He didn't ask anything. He just waited. She sat down across from him. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She stared at the surface of the coffee for a long time. "My father found me," she said. Cole kept his voice level. "I know." She looked up sharply. "You know, I know there was a letter from Boston 3 weeks ago, and you've been carrying it alone since." He held her gaze. "I didn't ask because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She stared at him. "You noticed 3 weeks ago." The day it arrived. Something crossed her face, complicated and layered relief and grief, and something that might have been the beginning of anger, though not at him. "He wants me to come back," she said. "He's threatening legal action if I don't. He says the marriage arrangement is still valid. He says Gerald Fitch is willing to..." She stopped, swallowed. "He's threatening to come here if I don't go back to him." Cole was very still. "He can't force you," he said. "Not legally. You're 22 years old. You're a free woman. Whatever arrangement your father made with Gerald Fitch, you were not a party to it." "I know that." Her voice was tight. "I know that legally. But my father is not a man who lets the law get in the way of what he's decided." She looked down at her hands. "He has money. He has connections. He'll make trouble. He's very good at making trouble. Let him." She looked up. "Miss Harper," Cole said, and his voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "Let him make all the trouble he's capable of making. This ranch is in Nevada. I know every judge in this county. I know the sheriff. If your father sets foot in Red Canyon with the intention of dragging you anywhere, he will find that the law out here doesn't work quite the way it does in Boston." She was very quiet. "You'd do that," she said. "Not a question exactly." "I'd do considerably more than that," he said, "if you want me to." "Why?" she said. And there was something raw in the word, something stripped of its defenses. "Why would you do all of that for someone you've known for 4 months? Someone you don't..." She stopped. "Don't what? Someone you haven't even..." She shook her head. Couldn't finish. Cole leaned forward slightly. "Because you are a person," he said, "who deserves to be treated like a person. And because in 4 months I have watched you rebuild a channel, reorganize 3 sets of financial records, teach 14 children arithmetic, and stare down Frank Delaney with a ledger, and I have yet to see you do a single thing that wasn't worth doing." He paused. "And because I made you a promise on that station platform that you don't owe me anything. I meant it then. I still mean it. Abigail looked at him across the table with those dark, careful eyes, and something in them was very close to breaking. Not in a bad way, but the way something breaks when the pressure that has been holding it rigid finally releases. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I don't know how to let someone help me without it costing me something." "I know you don't," he said. "That's not your fault. I keep waiting for the thing you want in exchange. I know you do, and when it doesn't come, I can't." She pressed her lips together. "I can't quite trust it." "That's all right," he said. "Trust takes time. I've got time." She sat there looking at him, and the fire crackled, and outside the February wind pushed at the walls of the house, and the whole wide dark of Nevada stretched in every direction. And Abigail Harper, who had spent 3 years saying no to a father who wouldn't hear it, who had arrived in this town half-starved and wall-eyed with wariness, who had spent 4 months building something real out of nothing, but her own stubborn refusal to stop trying, felt something shift in the foundation of every assumption she'd ever made about what it meant to be safe. She didn't say anything for a long time. "All right," she said at last. Same words she'd said in the barn back in October. Different weight entirely. "All right," he agreed. She didn't tell him everything that night. She wasn't ready for all of it. But she told him enough that the weight she'd been carrying alone became at least fractionally shared. And that was the night, though neither of them named it. That things between Cole Mercer and Abigail Harper became something neither of them had a word for. Yet something that wasn't courtship exactly, and wasn't friendship exactly, and wasn't the contractual arrangement that had brought her here. Something that was starting very slowly and very seriously to look like a choice that both of them were making freely. Which was exactly when the next blow landed. It came 3 days later, not from Boston, but from inside Red Canyon itself. Henderson came to the ranch on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression that told Cole the news was bad before a single word was said. "There's a land claim been filed," Henderson said, "against the north quarter of your property, filed 6 days ago in county records." Cole went very still. "By who?" "Man named Aldrich, Warren Aldrich, says he has a prior deed that predates yours." Henderson paused. "Cole, he's got a lawyer, already. And the lawyer is from San Francisco." The North Quarter was the channel, the new channel, the channel they had spent 2 weeks in freezing temperatures rebuilding. Cole stood on his porch and felt the particular cold of a man who understands that what's coming at him is bigger than a single blow. He understood in the way that a man who has worked the land long enough understands things that a land claim with a San Francisco lawyer filed 6 days after he'd publicly demonstrated the value of that irrigation work was not a coincidence. Someone had seen what Abigail built and decided they wanted it. He went inside. Abigail was at the table with her ledgers. She looked at his face. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She was quiet for exactly 10 seconds. He counted because watching her think was something he had learned to pay attention to. "Show me the original deed," she said. He got it. She read every word of it with the focused attention she brought to everything. "The north boundary line," she said. "It's described by landmark, a rock formation and a creek junction." "That's right." "Has the creek moved?" Cole looked at her. "Has it moved?" she repeated. "Since 1874, when this deed was filed. Creeks move, Mr. Mercer, particularly in areas with the kind of freeze-thaw cycles you have here. If the creek junction that defines your boundary has migrated even slightly, a clever lawyer could argue that the landmark no longer corresponds to the original description." Cole sat down slowly. "And if someone had surveyed the area recently," she continued, "and found that migration or manufactured evidence of it, they could claim the North Quarter falls outside my deed," he finished. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "We need to find every survey record for this land going back to the original filing. We need to establish where that creek was in 1874 and where it is now. And we need to do it before this Aldrich gets his San Francisco lawyer in front of a judge." Cole looked at her. This woman at his kitchen table with her notes and her steady brown eyes and her absolute refusal to be intimidated by anything, including a land claim backed by a lawyer from San Francisco. "You know," he said slowly, "you did not sign up for any of this." "No," she agreed. "I signed up for a quiet life on a Nevada ranch." She picked up her pen. "I should have read the fine print more carefully." She almost smiled. "Where do they keep survey records in this county?" And just like that, the fight began. They found the survey records on a Tuesday, buried in the back of the county clerk's office under 2 years of unfiled land transfers and a box of someone's personal correspondence that had ended up there by accident and clearly never been retrieved. Abigail had been at it since 7 in the morning. Cole had driven her to town before dawn, and she had walked into that office with her notebook and her pen, and the particular expression she wore when she had decided something was going to get done, regardless of what obstacles presented themselves, and she had started pulling documents. The clerk, a nervous young man named Petty, who had clearly never had anyone arrive before him at his own office and begin reorganizing his filing system, stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and admiration. "Ma'am," he said, "those records are public documents," she said without looking up. "Filed with the county and therefore accessible to any citizen with a legitimate legal interest, which I have." She looked up briefly. "I'd like coffee if you have it. 2 cups. Mr. Mercer takes his black." Petty made the coffee. Cole sat across from her and read documents she passed him, and by 10 o'clock they had found the original survey from 1871, the resurvey from 1874, when Cole's deed was filed, and a third survey from 1882 that nobody had apparently looked at in the intervening 9 years. Abigail laid all 3 side by side on the clerk's desk and studied them for a long time. "There," she said. Cole leaned in. She pointed to a notation in the 1882 survey, a small annotation in the surveyor's hand, barely legible, noting that the creek junction used as a landmark in the original deed had shifted approximately 14 feet northeast due to winter flooding in 1880. 14 feet, Cole said. 14 feet. She looked at him, which means by 1882 the creek junction no longer corresponded to the original landmark, which means anyone who surveyed after 1882 and knew what to look for could argue a discrepancy. "But the deed was filed in 1874, Cole said. "Before the shift." "Yes. Which means your deed is valid by the original landmark, not the current creek position." She straightened. "But Aldrich's lawyer is going to argue the current physical boundary. We need to argue the historical one." She tapped the 1882 survey. "This notation is the key." The surveyor documented the shift. It wasn't a natural ambiguity, it was a recorded event, which means any competent judge will have to recognize that the landmark in your deed refers to the pre-1880 position. Cole looked at her. "You figured all of that out from 3 survey maps in 3 hours." "I figured it out from 3 survey maps and a very useful civil engineering pamphlet I read in December," she said. "Do you want to win this, or do you want to be impressed by my reading habits? I've already asked you that question once." "Win it," he said immediately. "Then we need a lawyer." What they needed specifically was a lawyer who was better than Aldrich's San Francisco man, and that meant they needed someone who understood land law in the Nevada territory well enough to turn the 1882 survey notation into the linchpin of a defense. Cole knew a man in Carson City, a lawyer named Elias Pruitt, who had handled 3 land disputes in the county over the past decade and won 2 of them. He sent a telegram that afternoon. Pruitt arrived 2 days later on the morning train, a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and the brisk, economical manner of someone who had learned that time wasted in pleasantries was time not spent winning. He sat at Cole's kitchen table with the survey documents spread before him, and Abigail walked him through her analysis with the same clear precision she'd used on Frank Delaney's ledger. Pruitt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole. "Where did you find her?" he said. "She found me," Cole said. "Smart woman." Pruitt looked back at Abigail. Your analysis is correct. The 1882 notation is exactly what we need. Aldrich's lawyer is betting you don't have it that the filing is obscure enough to have been missed. He picked up the survey. He was wrong. He paused. There's still a fight. Aldrich has money. His lawyer will complicate things even with the documentation. How long? Cole said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. County court probably March. Pruitt began gathering the documents carefully. I'll need copies of everything. The original deed, all 3 surveys, and anything else in that county record that mentions the north boundary. I'll have copies made by tomorrow morning, Abigail said. Pruitt looked at her again. You available for the hearing? I may need someone who can walk the judge through the surveying logic. Abigail glanced at Cole. She's available? Cole said. I can speak for myself, Abigail said. Can you? Cole said mildly. A beat. Yes, she told Pruitt. I'm available. Pruitt left on the afternoon train. Cole and Abigail rode back to the ranch in silence for a while, the cold air moving between them, the wagon wheels finding every frozen rut in the road. You should have asked me first, she said. You're right, he said. I should have. She looked at him surprised by the lack of argument. I'm sorry, he said. It won't happen again. She turned back to the road. She was quiet for another moment. I would have said yes, she said. I know you would have. Then why didn't you ask? He thought about that honestly. Because for a second I forgot that you're not mine to speak for. He paused. Old habit. I've been running things alone for a long time. She considered that. So have I, she said. I know. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd ridden out in less distance, in it more of something else. More of 2 people who are slowly learning against every instinct they have to take up space in each other's world without treating it as a threat. It was Margaret Holt who told her about the other thing. The thing that made the land claim look in retrospect like the smaller of the 2 problems closing in at once. Margaret came to Abigail's arithmetic class on a Wednesday morning in early March with the particular expression of a woman who has information she wishes she didn't have. She waited until the children were gone. Then she sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at Abigail directly. There is a man in town, she said. He's been here 4 days. He's been asking questions about you. Abigail went very still. What kind of questions? Your background, your family, whether you arrived here alone. Margaret paused. Whether you and Cole Mercer are legally married. The room felt colder. What does he look like? Abigail said. Her voice was steady. It was an act of will. 50 perhaps, well dressed for a man this far west. Carries himself like someone who is accustomed to being obeyed. Margaret watched her. Do you know who he is? Abigail stood up very slowly. His name is Gerald Fitch, she said. She told Margaret everything. Not all at once it came in pieces, each piece harder than the last, the way very old pain always comes when it finally stops being contained. Margaret sat across from her and listened with the focused, unshockable attention of a woman who has heard a great many difficult things in a pastor's house over 30 years. And when Abigail finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. He's staying at the hotel on 2nd Street, Margaret said. He had dinner with Warren Aldrich last night. The room stopped. Abigail looked at her. Say that again. Gerald Fitch, Margaret said carefully. Had dinner with Warren Aldrich, the man who filed the land claim against Cole's North Quarter. The thing fell into place with a clarity that was almost physical, like a key turning in a lock that had been puzzling her for weeks. The land claim filed 6 days after the channel was rebuilt. The San Francisco lawyer, the timing of it all. She had assumed it was opportunism, someone seeing the value of the improved irrigation and moving to take it. It wasn't opportunism. It was her father's reach wearing a different face. Gerald Fitch had not come to Red Canyon to retrieve a runaway bride. He had come to make certain that if Abigail wouldn't come back willingly, the thing she'd built here would be taken apart piece by piece until there was nothing left to stay for. She stood up. "Where are you going?" Margaret said. "To find Cole." She found him at the barn. She told him in under 2 minutes, fast and clear, and without flinching from any of it, Fitch Aldrich. The dinner, the connection she'd made, all of it. Cole listened without moving. His face was very still in the particular way it got when he was working hard to keep something controlled that badly wanted not to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father sent him," he said. "My father funded him," she said. "Fitch has money of his own, but not enough for a San Francisco lawyer, and a land claim in a territory he'd never heard of 6 months ago. Someone pointed him here, and someone paid for the infrastructure." She looked at Cole steadily. "This was never about the land. It was about making it so painful for you to keep me that you'd send me back yourself." The muscle in Cole's jaw moved once. "That," he said, "is not going to happen." "Cole, Abigail." His voice was level, but something underneath it had an edge. "I want to be very clear about something. Nothing that man does, nothing your father funds, nothing any lawyer in San Francisco argues in front of any judge in this county is going to make me hand you over to people who think you're a thing to be retrieved." He paused. "That is not a discussion." She looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared somewhere on the walk from town to argue with him. To tell him it wasn't his fight, that she hadn't meant to drag him into something this complicated, that he had every right to. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again, steadier. "Then we fight both of them at once." "We fight both of them at once," he agreed. Gerald Fitch made his move the next morning. He came to the ranch. He came in a hired carriage, which in Red Canyon was such an unusual sight that 3 people watched it from their porches as it rolled down the main road toward the Mercer property. He arrived at 9 o'clock, knocked on the door with the deliberate courtesy of a man who has already decided how this conversation ends. Cole opened it. Fitch was exactly what Abigail had described, a man in his early 50s who wore prosperity the way some men wore weapons, as a form of intimidation. He had a lawyer with him. Not the San Francisco man, but a local one, which told Cole immediately that this visit was not official. It was personal. "Mr. Mercer," Fitch said. "My name is—" "I know who you are," Cole said. A brief pause. "Then you know why I'm here." "I know what you think you're here for," Cole said. "Come in." He stepped back from the door. Not in welcome exactly, more in the manner of a man who prefers to have difficult conversations inside, rather than on his porch where anyone walking by can hear them. Fitch came in. His lawyer followed. Cole did not offer either of them coffee. Abigail was at the table. She had chosen to be there, had chosen deliberately and clearly when Cole offered her the choice of staying or going to Margaret's to stay. She sat with her hands flat on the tabletop and looked at Gerald Fitch with the expression of a woman who has spent 22 years learning how to be unafraid of him and is still working on the last few miles of that road. Fitch looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not quite sentiment, but the particular expression of a man who has wanted something for a long time and is now looking at it across a room. "Abigail," he said. "Mr. Fitch," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "Your father is very worried about you." "My father," she said, "is very worried about his business arrangement." Fitch's expression didn't change. He was practiced at this, Cole could see, practiced at the controlled, reasonable surface over whatever was actually operating underneath. "The arrangement was made for your benefit," Fitch said. "Your father wanted to ensure your security." "At 51 years old," she said, "you have more past than future, Mr. Fitch. I don't consider that security." "Abigail." "She's not going anywhere," Cole said. Fitch turned to look at him. "Mr. Mercer, with respect, you and Miss Harper are not married. She arrived here on a contractual arrangement that was never formalized. Legally, you have no—" "Legally," Cole said, She's a 22-year-old woman who came to Nevada of her own free will and has lived here for 7 months and hasn't broken a single law. You have no claim on her. Her father has no claim on her. Gerald Fitch. He said the name the way he'd say a legal citation, flat and exact, has absolutely no claim on her. The arrangement was made between her father and you. She wasn't a party to it. She didn't sign it. She didn't agree to it. Cole's voice had not risen. It was very, very level. In the state of Nevada, that's not a contract. That's just two men deciding something that wasn't theirs to decide. Fitch looked at him for a long moment. You've been talking to a lawyer, he said. I've been talking to several lawyers, Cole said, including Elias Pruitt, who knows every judge in this county and expects to see you and your associate Mr. Aldrich in court next month. The name landed. Fitch's composure held, but something behind it shifted. That is a separate matter, Fitch said carefully. Is it? Cole said. Because I find it interesting that the land claim on my North Quarter was filed 6 days after an improvement that increased the property value by a man you had dinner with last week. That's quite a coincidence. Mr. Mercer, I'm not done. Cole stepped forward 1 step, just one. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I want you to hear me clearly. Whatever arrangement you made with Abigail's father, it ends here. Whatever you and Aldrich have been planning with my land, that ends in court. And if you or anyone acting on your behalf makes any move toward this woman, he paused very briefly, you will find out that Nevada judges take a very particular view of men who travel from other states to harass women who have left them behind. Silence. Fitch looked at Abigail. She met his gaze without flinching. This isn't over, he said. I know it isn't, she said. I've been preparing for that. He left. His lawyer left. The hired carriage rolled back down the road toward town, and Cole stood at the window and watched it go, and Abigail sat at the table and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 7 minutes. You all right? Cole said, without turning from the window. No, she said honestly, but I will be. He turned then. He looked at her across the room, this woman who had just sat 3 feet from the man her father had tried to sell her to, and not moved a single muscle in surrender. And he felt something so complete and so certain that it almost frightened him with its steadiness. Abigail, he said. She looked at him. I need to tell you something. His voice was quiet. And I'm not saying it to pressure you or push you toward anything. I'm saying it because I think you've spent enough time not knowing how things actually stand. She waited. I love you, he said, simple as that. No decoration, no hedging, no strategic placement. Just true and said because it was. The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time with those dark, careful eyes. And he watched the wariness in them. The old, deep-trained wariness that expected a price tag on every offer. The wariness of a woman who had been leveraged against her own heart for years. He watched it wrestle with something else. Something newer. Something that was trying very hard to be allowed to exist. Cole, she said. You don't have to say anything back, he said immediately. I mean that. This isn't. I know it isn't, she said. I know. She stood up from the table. She crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet from him, which was the closest she had voluntarily placed herself to him since the day she arrived. I don't know how to do this, she said, very quietly. I don't know how to. I was never taught that this was something I was allowed to want for myself. I know, he said. I need time. I know that too. And you'll wait? She said, carefully, like a question she was afraid of the answer to. Abigail, he said, I drove a man who threatened you off my property this morning, and I'm about to go to court to defend a land claim that was designed to drive you away from here. What exactly do you think the answer to that question is? She looked at him. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train 7 months ago, Abigail Harper smiled. Not the small, careful, controlled smile she used for public occasions. Not the brief, involuntary flash of warmth that escaped her sometimes when he said something unexpected, but a real one. full and sudden and unguarded, the smile of a woman who has just been allowed to feel something she had stopped believing she was entitled to feel. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. They had Cole knew a land court hearing in 3 weeks, a San Francisco lawyer to outmaneuver, and a second letter that had arrived from Boston that morning that neither of them had opened yet, sitting on the kitchen table in its envelope with its neat Boston postmark waiting. They had all of that. But for this one moment, in this one room with February dying outside and March coming in hard, what they had was each other clearly, openly, without pretense or arrangement or the weight of anyone else's plans. It was the truest thing either of them had stood inside in a very long time. And then the door opened. Neither of them had heard the carriage come back. Neither of them had heard the footsteps on the porch. But the door opened, and it was not Fitch who walked in. It was a man Abigail had not seen in 7 months. A man whose face she had looked at across breakfast tables her entire life. A man who had written 6 pages of threats and sent them in an envelope with a Boston postmark. Her father walked into Cole Mercer's house and looked at his daughter across the room and said very quietly, "Come home, Abigail." And the whole thing that they had just built, the fragile, hard-won, slowly constructed thing, shook right down to its foundation. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. That was how long it took Abigail's body to remember how to function 3 seconds of complete stillness. The way an animal freezes when it recognizes a predator. It has spent its whole life trying to outrun. Then the stillness broke, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and became visibly and deliberately someone who was not afraid. She was in fact terrified. But terror and fear were different things, and she had learned the difference the hard way over 22 years. Edward Harper was 60 years old and looked 50. He was a tall man, lean, with the kind of authority that comes not from physical size, but from decades of being the person in every room whose opinion determined outcomes. He wore a good coat. He carried his hat in his hand. He looked at his daughter across Cole Mercer's kitchen with an expression that managed to communicate disappointment, concern, and absolute expectation all at once, the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Abigail," he said again, "come home." She did not move toward him. "How did you get in?" she said. The door was unlocked. "That," Cole said from where he stood, 6 feet to Abigail's left, "is not how doors work." Edward Harper turned his attention to Cole, with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who has assessed the room and determined where the obstacle is. He looked at Cole, the way men like him looked at things that were in their way, not with anger exactly, but with the kind of measuring calculation that precedes removal. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I appreciate that you have provided my daughter with shelter during what has been a difficult period. I understand you acted in good faith. I'm not here to make trouble for you." "You're here because the man you sent ahead of you didn't get what he came for," Cole said. A brief pause. "Gerald is here at my request, yes. And Warren Aldrich." The pause this time was fractionally longer. "I'm not familiar with—" "Mr. Harper." Cole's voice was flat and completely without heat. "Don't do that. I know what was filed and when it was filed, and I know what it cost to file it. Elias Pruitt knows too. So does the county judge, who is a personal friend of mine and who found the timing of that claim extremely interesting." He stepped forward, not aggressively, just closing the distance until he was standing clearly, unmistakably between Edward Harper and his daughter. "So, let's agree to be honest with each other. It'll save us all a lot of time." Edward Harper looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Abigail. "You've been talking to him." "I've been living here for 7 months, she said. "We've talked about a great many things, Abigail." His voice shifted, not softer exactly, but lower, more private. The voice he used with family, which meant the voice designed to reach the part of her that still remembered being his daughter, before she remembered being her own person. "I am your father. Everything I have done has been for your benefit. Gerald Fitch is a good man with means and stability who can offer you a future." Gerald Fitch, she said, had dinner with the man who tried to steal Cole's land, a land claim that by remarkable coincidence was filed the same week Gerald arrived in Nevada. She looked at her father steadily. "That is not a good man doing good things. That is a man being used as a weapon, and you handed him the ammunition. I was protecting. You were controlling, she said. There is a difference. You have never once in my life understood that difference. The room was very quiet. Edward Harper's jaw tightened. Just once, just briefly, the tell of a man who has been said an accurate thing he was not prepared to hear. You are 22 years old, he said. You do not understand what the world does to a woman without protection. I understand considerably better than you think, she said. I've spent the last 7 months learning it, and what I've learned is that the kind of protection you're describing is indistinguishable from a cage. He turned back to Cole. The pivot was deliberate, a man choosing a different angle of attack when the direct approach meets resistance. Mr. Mercer, he said, name your price. Cole looked at him. Excuse me. You brought her here on a contractual arrangement. The arrangement was not formalized. I am prepared to compensate you fairly for your time and expense and to ensure that no legal complications arise from— Stop, Cole said. Edward Harper stopped. I want to make something very clear to you, Cole said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been patient for a long time and has found the absolute edge of it. Your daughter is not a debt to be settled. She is not a contractual obligation. She is not an asset that changed hands when she stepped off that train. She is a person, a remarkable, capable, extraordinary person who came here and built something real with her own hands and her own mind, and she has earned every inch of the life she has made here. He paused. There is no price. There is no arrangement. There is no version of this conversation that ends with her getting in a carriage with you. Edward Harper looked at him for a long moment. She's my daughter, he said. And beneath the authority and the calculation, something else moved, something older and more complicated. Not love exactly, or not only love, because love and ownership can occupy the same space in a man, and he can convince himself they are the same thing. I know she is, Cole said, and someday if you're very fortunate she might decide to write you a letter. But that'll be her decision. Abigail had watched. This entire exchange had watched Cole stand between her and her father and hold that ground with a steadiness that had nothing aggressive in it. Nothing performed, just the absolute conviction of a man who knows what is right and has decided to be it. And she felt something happen in the deepest part of her that she did not entirely have words for. She stepped forward, came to stand beside Cole, not behind him. Beside him. Father, she said, I am not coming home. He looked at her. And something in his face, something that had been held rigid by years of certainty, cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to show the thing underneath, which was not malice, but grief. The grief of a man who has confused possession with love for so long that he cannot tell them apart and does not know how to retrieve one without the other. Abigail, he said quietly, I don't know how to— He stopped, started again. Your mother would have told you to let me go, she said. Her voice was not cruel. It was just true. You know she would have. A silence. He stood there for a moment that seemed longer than it was, holding his hat in both hands, and for just that moment he was not a businessman with Boston connections and a San Francisco lawyer and a 51-year-old associate with a land claim. He was just a man who had lost his wife 8 years ago and had held on to his daughter too hard ever since, and had bent that holding until it became something she had to run from. He put his hat on. I'll withdraw the land claim, he said. Cole looked at him. And Fitch. Gerald will go home. Today, Cole said. Not a question. A pause. Today. He looked at Abigail one more time. She met his gaze and did not look away, and did not soften, because softening now would undo every hard-won inch of the last 7 months. I'll write, she said finally. When I'm ready. He nodded once, then he walked out the door. They heard the carriage. They heard it roll away down the road. Then there was silence. Abigail stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down and put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them. Cole sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on more than she'd ever intended. "He actually left," she said. "He did." "I didn't think he would." "Neither did I entirely," Cole said honestly. She looked up at him. "What would you have done if he hadn't?" "Called the sheriff," Cole said, "and then Pruitt, in that order." She almost smiled. Just like that. Just like that. She looked back at her hands, took a slow breath. "I've been afraid of that moment for 7 months," she said. Standing in front of him and telling him no and having it actually mean something. She paused. "I thought it would feel different." "How does it feel?" She considered that honestly. "Like something heavy that I put down and now I'm not sure what to do with my hands." Cole nodded slowly. "That's about right." She looked at him across the table, and there was something open in her face. Not the careful, measured openness she'd been offering him in small increments since October, but something wider, something that had been waiting behind the wall her father represented and was now with that wall removed visible. "Cole," she said. "Yeah, what you said earlier." She held his gaze. "Before he came in." He waited. "I need you to know that I—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at this. I've never been allowed to be good at this." "I know. But what I feel—" She pressed her lips together and he could see her wrestling with it. This woman who was brave about everything except the thing that required her to be vulnerable. "It isn't nothing. It isn't even close to nothing." He looked at her steadily. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She let out a breath that had been held for a long time. Outside, spring was beginning tentatively, cautiously, the way spring comes to Nevada. Not all at once, but in pieces. A warm afternoon here, a morning without frost. There the land deciding slowly that it might be willing to try again. The court date was 3 weeks away. The land claim would be withdrawn, which changed the shape of everything, but Pruitt still needed to be informed, and there were documents to update, and the channel needed one more inspection before the planting season started. There was, in other words, still a great deal of work to do. But the thing that had been pressing on her sternum since November, since the Boston envelope, since the arrival of Fitch, since her father's face had appeared in her nightmares, with increasing frequency, that thing had released. And in its absence, Abigail Harper discovered something she had not felt since she was a young girl. Space. Room inside her own life to look around and consider what she actually wanted to put there. The hearing came anyway. Edward Harper had said he would withdraw the claim, and he had eventually. But lawyers moved slowly, even when instructed to move quickly. And Warren Aldrich, who had his own reasons, separate from Edward Harper's money, for wanting that North Quarter, filed a counter-petition that delayed the withdrawal by 2 weeks. Which meant that on the 3rd Tuesday of March, Cole and Abigail and Elias Pruitt sat at a table in the county courthouse in front of Judge Harlan Beeks, while Aldrich's San Francisco lawyer made his arguments. Abigail had testified in front of people before, in the sense that she had presented financial analyses to skeptical men who did not initially believe a woman could do the arithmetic, but she had never testified in a court of law. She was on the stand for 40 minutes. The San Francisco lawyer, whose name was Whitmore, and who had the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to winning through sheer volume of words, tried 3 different approaches to rattle her composure. None of them worked. She walked Judge Beeks through the 3 surveys with the same clear precision she'd used on Pruitt in Cole's kitchen, the same calm that had made Martha Kellison reassess her and Frank Delaney furious. And 14 children actually learned their multiplication tables. She answered every question directly. She conceded the points that were genuinely uncertain and held firm on the points that were not. When Whitmore suggested her analysis was the work of an amateur without professional qualifications, she cited the civil engineering text she'd drawn from Name the Author, Name the Edition, and offered to walk him through the underlying mathematics if he needed assistance. Judge Beeks actually smiled at that. Just briefly. Pruitt did the rest. He was methodical and precise, and he had known Harlan Beeks for 15 years, which meant he knew exactly which arguments would resonate and which would slide off. The ruling came that same afternoon. Cole's deed was valid. The North Quarter was his. The claim was dismissed. Aldrich walked out of the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His San Francisco lawyer followed with the expression of a man who was already calculating his invoice. Cole stood on the courthouse steps with Pruitt and felt the particular relief of a man who has been holding his breath for 8 weeks. "Your young woman," Pruitt said, watching Abigail speak with Judge Beeks inside through the courthouse window, "is one of the most effective witnesses I have ever put on a stand." "She's not my young woman," Cole said automatically. Pruitt looked at him. "No." Cole watched her through the window, watched her shake Beeks's hand, watched the judge say something that made her laugh, watched her turn and see Cole through the glass and hold his gaze for just a moment with that expression that was still learning how to be unguarded. "Not yet," Cole said. Pruitt nodded thoughtfully. "Well," he said, picking up his case, "I'd suggest not waiting too long. Spring settled in properly after that. The channel held. The early crops came up. The ranch hands had work to do and did it." The ledger showed numbers that actually corresponded to reality for the first time in years, because Abigail kept it current every week with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything she decided deserved her care. The town shifted. Not dramatically. Small towns never shift dramatically, but in the way a river shifts following the path of least resistance toward what is simply obviously true. Abigail Harper had been here 8 months. She had identified fraud in a ledger, redesigned an irrigation channel, taught arithmetic to the children of half the families in the county, testified in a land dispute and won, and stood in front of a man from Boston who had come to take her away and told him no. Red Canyon was not a town that changed its opinion easily. But it was a town that respected competence, and Abigail had supplied that in quantities that were difficult to argue with. Martha Kellison stopped her on the street one April morning. "Miss Harper," she said. Abigail braced herself slightly, the old reflex. "I owe you an apology," Martha said, brisk, direct the way she did most things. "I made assumptions when you arrived that were uncharitable and inaccurate. I should have known better." She paused. "I did know better, and I did it anyway, which is worse." Abigail looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that. I'd also like—" Martha hesitated, which was unusual enough that Abigail paid close attention. "I'd like to speak to you about starting a proper lending library in the county. We have the building. We don't have anyone who knows how to organize it." She looked at Abigail steadily. "I understand you have some thoughts about organization." Abigail thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "When would you like to start?" she said. Martha Kellison smiled for the first time in Abigail's memory. It changed her face entirely. "Monday," she said. The lending library project launched in April. The channel irrigation improvements were written up by the county agricultural office and distributed to 12 other ranches in the valley. 3 women came to Abigail separately in the space of 2 weeks, asking for advice on their household finances. Not their husbands' business accounts, but their own money. The money they managed and tracked and tried to make stretch. She sat with each of them at her kitchen table and went through their numbers with the same respect she gave to any other document, and left each of them with something they hadn't had before: clarity about what they actually had and what they could actually do with it. Something was growing in Red Canyon that had not existed 8 months ago, and it had Abigail Harper's fingerprints all over it. Cole watched all of it. He watched her from the particular vantage point of a man who has learned to be patient with the things that matter most, who has learned that the fastest way to lose something worth having is to grip it before it's ready to be held. He did not press. He did not hint. He did not create situations designed to move them toward something she hadn't arrived at herself. But one evening in late April after supper, when she was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the lending library catalog with the focused intensity she brought to any project she'd claimed as her own, he said from across the room, very quietly, "You're happy?" She looked up. "That's not a question," he said. "I'm not asking. I'm just saying it, because I don't know if anyone's said it to you lately. You're happy. It looks good on you." She held his gaze for a moment. "I am," she said. And there was something in how she said it, not surprised exactly, but careful. Careful the way someone is careful with something new and not entirely sure it will hold. I didn't know what this felt like. I'm not sure I ever knew. Does it feel different than you expected? She thought about that honestly. I expected it to feel like relief, she said. Like the absence of bad things. That's what I thought. Happiness was just the space left when the difficult things weren't happening. And it's not that, she said. It's the presence of something, not the absence. She looked down at her catalog, then back up at him. It's this kitchen, this town, these children I argue with 3 mornings a week about why they need to learn long division. She paused. It's you. The room was very quiet. Cole set down what he was holding. Abigail, he said. I know, she said quickly. I know I said I needed time. I know I'm not. I know I still have things I'm working through. But I wanted you to know that. She held his gaze, and there was something in it now that was not careful at all. Something that had stopped managing itself and was just simply true. I wanted you to know where you stand. He crossed the room, sat down across from her. Looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 8 months, with the attention of a man who has decided something is worth every ounce of patience he has ever cultivated. Where do I stand? He said. You stand, she said slowly, in the middle of the only life I have ever wanted, that I chose for myself, that belongs to me. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just rested it there, light, giving her every opportunity to move. She didn't move. Then I reckon, he said quietly, I'm standing in exactly the right place. She looked down at their hands for a moment. Cole, she said. Yeah. Ask me. He looked at her. Are you sure? I have never, she said, been more certain of anything in my life. He took a breath. Abigail Harper, he said. Will you marry me? Not because you owe me anything, not because you need protection or security or a reason to stay, but because you want to, because you're choosing it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had given her a room with a lock on the door and never once asked for the key, who had stood between her and her father and not yielded an inch, who had waited through 7 months of her learning how to trust without a single complaint or a single moment of pressure. This man who had treated her from the first evening on that train platform like someone whose choice was the only one that mattered. Yes, she said, because I want to, because I'm choosing it. He smiled, then not the controlled, understated, almost smile she'd seen in occasional flashes, but a real one. And it changed his whole face the same way Margaret Holt's smile had changed hers, the way realness always changes a face that has been composed for too long. Outside Nevada in late April was deciding to be beautiful. The channel was running clean. The crops were coming up. The town was full of people who had started slowly and without announcement to understand that what they had assumed about the frightened young woman who stepped off the train last summer had been wrong in almost every particular. Inside at a kitchen table covered in library catalogs and ledger notes and the accumulated evidence of a life being actively, deliberately, joyfully built. 2 people who had found each other through the most improbable of arrangements sat together and felt the particular rightness of a decision freely made. There was still a great deal of work ahead. There always was. That was the nature of land and love and lives worth living. But the hardest part, the part where she had to learn that freedom was real and that she was entitled to it, that part was done. And what came next was entirely, completely, irrevocably hers. She said yes on a Thursday evening in late April, and by Friday morning, all of Red Canyon knew about it. That was the thing about small towns. They didn't need a newspaper for the news that actually mattered. Margaret Holt heard it from her husband, who had seen Cole at the hardware store buying something that made him smile in a way Cole Mercer had never been observed smiling before. Martha Kellison heard it from Margaret. The ranch hands heard it from each other. By noon, 3 women had stopped by the ranch on various pretexts, returning a borrowed pan, asking about library hours, inquiring about a recipe that had never actually been requested. And every one of them left, having congratulated Abigail with a warmth that would have been unimaginable 8 months ago. Abigail received each of them at the door with the composed grace she brought to most things. Said thank you, meant it, and went back to her catalog work. But when the last one left, and the house was quiet again, she sat at the table and felt something she hadn't been prepared for. Something that moved through her chest like a current, warm and unfamiliar and entirely welcome. She had been congratulated before. At finishing school, at piano recitals, at the various performances of dutiful daughterhood that her father had staged over the years. She knew what obligatory congratulation felt like. This was different. This was people who had doubted her, who had whispered about her, who had watched her from a careful distance for months, and who were now genuinely glad for her. She had not expected to care so much about the difference. Cole found her sitting there when he came in for lunch. "You all right?" he said. "People keep congratulating me," she said. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it. "No," she said slowly. "That's what's strange. It isn't." She looked up at him. 6 months ago, I would have found it unbearable. Being watched, being the subject of the town's attention. And now it just feels. She searched for the word, like belonging somewhere. He sat down across from her. "You do belong here." "I know," she said. And the simplicity of it, the fact that she could say that without the old reflexive flinch, without waiting to see what the knowing would cost her, that was the thing that made her breath catch slightly. "I know I do." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet of the kitchen, in the life they were building, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else. The wedding was set for June. Not a rushed affair, and not a lavish one. Something in between, the way most things worth doing occupy the middle ground between impulse and ceremony. Margaret Holt offered the church. Martha Kellison organized a reception afterward, with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything. And when Abigail tried to thank her, Martha waved her off with the practicality of a woman who expresses affection through logistics. "I've been planning community events in this county for 20 years, Martha said. "Let me do something useful with it." Abigail let her. There was, in the 5 weeks between the engagement and the wedding, one more thing that needed to happen. One more piece of unfinished business that Abigail had been carrying quietly, waiting for the right moment. She wrote to her father, not the letter she had written in her head 100 times over the past 8 months, the letter full of accumulated grievance and justified anger and the careful documentation of every way he had failed her. She'd written that letter mentally so many times it had worn grooves in her. She didn't send that one. She sent 3 pages. Honest, direct, without cruelty and without apology for anything that didn't warrant one. She told him she was getting married. She told him Cole's name and something of his character, not to seek approval, but because even a father who had handled everything badly deserved to know something real about the man his daughter had chosen. She told him she was well. She told him she had built a life she was proud of. She told him she hoped in time they might find a way to correspond that didn't involve leverage or threat. She did not tell him she forgave him. She wasn't there yet, and she had learned in the last several months that pretending to be somewhere you weren't was a form of dishonesty that cost more than it saved. She sealed the envelope and mailed it on a Tuesday morning, and when she walked away from the post office, she felt something settle in her. Not resolution exactly, not the clean completion of a closed chapter, but something quieter. The recognition that she had said what was true, offered what she could offer, and released the rest. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. Cole noticed the change in her that afternoon without asking about it. He just looked at her when she came back from town and said, "You did something hard this morning. How do you know? You look like you do when you finish something difficult, like you've put a weight down." She looked at him. "I wrote to my father." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to tell me what you said," he said. "I know I don't." She paused. "I told him the truth, that's all." She met his eyes. "I've been telling the truth for months. I figured I might as well extend that to him." Cole was quiet for a moment. That took courage. "Everything worth doing does," she said. And then she picked up her jacket and went back to the library catalog, and that was the end of it. Clean and complete and finished the way only the things we finally choose to finish can be. The week before the wedding, Frank Delaney came to the ranch. Cole saw him coming up the road from the barn and took a moment to prepare himself, because Frank Delaney arriving uninvited was never a comfortable development. But Frank walked up to the porch with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man engaged in a genuine internal struggle, and that was a sufficiently unusual sight that Cole waited without speaking. "I owe you an apology," Frank said. "Both of you." He looked past Cole toward the house. "Is Miss Harper? Is she here?" "She is," Cole said. "I'd like to say it to both of you." Cole stepped back from the door. Abigail came to the doorway. She looked at Frank Delaney with the steady, neutral expression she reserved for situations that required her to listen before she decided how to respond. Frank turned his hat twice in his hands. "I was wrong," he said. "When she first arrived, I said things about her that weren't fair. And then what I did with the feed accounts which she caught, which she was right to catch and right to call out." He stopped, started again. "I've been a small man about this, and I know it. And I wanted to say that to your faces because it seems like the only kind of apology that means anything is the one you say out loud to the person." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "that was not easy to do." "No, ma'am. I appreciate it." She paused. "The accounts are settled. What's done is done." Frank nodded. He looked at Cole. "She's something else." He said the same words Henderson had used months ago, the same conclusion that Red Canyon had been arriving at, one person at a time. "Yeah," Cole said. "She is." Frank put his hat back on. He extended his hand to Cole. Cole shook it. Then Frank turned to Abigail and extended it to her, and she shook it too. And that was the particular kind of small ceremony that means more than most formal ones, because it wasn't required by anything except the conscience of the man who initiated it. After he left, Cole looked at Abigail. "You were generous," he said. "He was honest," she said simply. "Honesty deserves generosity. That's the deal." 3 days before the wedding, a letter came from Boston. Abigail recognized the handwriting and felt the old reflex, the tightening in her chest, the instinctive calculation of exits. Then she recognized it as a reflex and not a reality, and she took a breath and opened it. Her father had written 4 pages. She read them standing at the kitchen table. The first page was stiff and formal, the writing of a man who is not accustomed to any mode of communication that isn't transactional. He acknowledged that she had made her position clear. He acknowledged that Gerald Fitch was no longer relevant to any plans he had for her future. He acknowledged, with the particular phrasing of a man who cannot quite bring himself to say a thing directly, that he had perhaps handled certain matters poorly. Perhaps. That word was doing a great deal of work. Abigail noticed it and let it go. The second page surprised her. He wrote about her mother. He wrote about how Eleanor Harper had been the most capable person he had ever known, and how he had spent 30 years not quite understanding that admiring her capability and allowing her to use it freely were not the same thing. He wrote that he could see in the letter Abigail had sent him something of Eleanor, in the way his daughter expressed herself clear and direct and without performance. He did not say he was proud of her, but he came very close. The third page was about the lending library. Someone had mentioned it to him she didn't know, who didn't know how, and he had looked into what she'd built, the catalog system, the outreach, the financial model she'd designed to make it sustainable. He had opinions about the financial model because he was Edward Harper, and he always had opinions about financial models, and his opinions were not wrong. The fourth page was short. It said, "I will not be able to attend the wedding. I understand this is appropriate given the circumstances, and I do not offer it as complaint. I wish you well, Abigail. I have always wished you well. I am sorry that I did not always show it in ways you could receive." She stood at the table for a long time after she finished reading. Cole came in from outside and saw her face. "Good or bad?" he said. She thought about it. "Both," she said. "Mostly good." She set the letter down. "He's not coming to the wedding. How do you feel about that?" She considered the question with the honesty she brought to everything. "Relieved," she said, "and a little sad, at the same time." She looked at Cole. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "That's just what complicated love feels like." She nodded slowly. "He's not a good man in some ways. And he's not as bad a man as I needed to believe he was for a while to get out." She paused. "I think the truth is somewhere between those two things." "Usually is," Cole said. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the writing desk drawer. Not in the trunk under the blankets where she'd hidden the first terrible letter back in November. In the desk, where she kept things she intended to return to. That distinction meant something, and she knew it. June 14th arrived the way mornings do when you have been anticipating them so long. They feel simultaneously inevitable and impossible all at once, and not quite real until you are standing in the middle of it. Abigail dressed in the room that had been hers for 10 months, in the dress that Margaret Holt and Martha Kellison and 3 other women of Red Canyon had helped her make from fabric she'd chosen herself, not white, because she was a practical woman, and white was impractical, but ivory, with blue at the collar and cuffs. She stood at the small mirror and looked at herself for a long time. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train at this town's platform last August with one suitcase, and the expression of someone expecting the worst. She thought about all the things that woman had not yet known: the room with the lock, the ledgers, the children and their multiplication tables, the irrigation channel, the county courthouse, the kitchen table where she had learned slowly and with great difficulty, and against every instinct she had been given, to trust something that was actually trustworthy. She thought about the letter from Boston sitting in the writing desk. She thought about everything she had built and chosen and earned. Then she picked up her small bouquet wildflowers, because she preferred things that grew where they wanted to, rather than where they were placed, and she opened the door and walked out into the life she had chosen. Margaret met her at the church door, looked at her with the expression of a woman who has watched something difficult become something beautiful and feels the particular satisfaction of having been present for the whole journey. "Ready?" Margaret said. "I've been ready," Abigail said, "for considerably longer than this morning." Margaret smiled and opened the door. The church was full. That was the first thing she registered: how full it was. Not just the families she'd expected: the Hendersons and the Holts and the women from her finance sessions and the parents of her arithmetic students. Frank Delaney was there in the 3rd row, with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who has decided to be better than he was. Old Petty. The county clerk was there, which surprised her and then didn't, because she'd spent the better part of 3 days in his office reorganizing his filing system, and he'd been inordinately grateful. People she recognized only in passing, people she hadn't expected, people who had been watching the whole story from various distances, and had come today because the ending was worth being present for. And at the front of the church, Cole Mercer stood in a good dark coat that she had never seen before, holding his hat in his hands the way he'd held it the very first day on the platform, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has waited for exactly the right thing, for exactly the right amount of time, and knows with complete certainty that the waiting was worth every day of it. She walked toward him. She didn't think about her father, not then. She didn't think about Gerald Fitch, or Warren Aldrich, or the San Francisco lawyer, or the land claim, or any of the forces that had tried in their various ways to make this moment impossible. She thought about the first night she'd eaten supper across from this man in a quiet corner of a Main Street restaurant, exhausted and terrified, and so defended she barely recognized herself. She thought about the key to the room. She thought about him saying the night she confessed her fear about the letter, "If you decide to leave tomorrow, I'll drive you to the station myself." She stopped in front of him. He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she had come to know over 10 months, something quiet and absolute and entirely without performance. "Hi," he said softly, just that. "Hi," she said. The pastor began. Abigail heard the words, the old familiar words, the ones that had been spoken over couples in churches for centuries, and she heard them differently than she would have heard them a year ago. Not as a contract, not as a transfer of custody from one man to another, not as the formalization of an arrangement. She heard them as what they actually were, stripped of all the ways they had been misused. A choice. A public, witnessed, freely made choice. Her choice. When the pastor reached the vows, Cole spoke first. He had not written anything down. She had wondered if he would, and she had her answer. He looked at her and spoke from the place where he kept the things that actually mattered. The place he didn't access often, but didn't need to, because when he did, what came out was always exactly true. "Abigail," he said, "I'm not going to promise you things I can't control. I can't promise you easy winters or simple years, or that things won't get hard sometimes, because they will." He paused. "What I can promise you is this. I will never make you feel like you owe me something for being decent to you. I will never take a single inch of ground you haven't offered freely. I will never mistake your choice to be here for something I'm entitled to." He held her gaze steady and certain and entirely himself. "And every morning for the rest of my life, I am going to be grateful that you chose this, that you chose me." The church was very quiet. Abigail took a breath. She had written something down. She took it from her pocket, a small folded paper, which she opened carefully, and then looked at it for a moment, and then folded it back up and put it away. "I had a whole speech," she said. A quiet laugh moved through the congregation. "But I think what I actually want to say is simpler than that." She looked at Cole. "I came here expecting a transaction. I came here because I was out of options, and I was frightened, and I didn't know how to want something for myself anymore." She paused. "What I found instead was a man who gave me a room with a lock on the door and a key that was only mine, and never once asked me to open it until I was ready." Her voice was steady, completely steady. The voice of a woman who has arrived. "You gave me back the thing I didn't know I'd lost. You gave me back the right to choose." She held his gaze. "I am here because I choose to be. Every day. That's the only kind of staying that means anything, and I want you to know that's what this is." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Cole's jaw moved once. His eyes were very bright. The rings were exchanged. The vows were completed. And when the pastor said the words that made it official, and Cole Mercer kissed his wife for the first time in front of every person in Red Canyon, Nevada, the church filled with the particular sound of people who have watched something earn its ending. Not applause, exactly. Not just applause, but something fuller than that. Recognition. Collective recognition of something true. The reception was on the grounds outside the church. Martha Kellison had outdone herself tables food a fiddle player who knew a surprising number of songs. And Red Canyon in June was the best version of itself, warm and wide open and unguarded. Abigail moved through it in a state of controlled wonder, talking to people, accepting congratulations, eating things she hadn't eaten since Boston, and some things she'd never eaten before, and feeling at every moment the specific quiet rightness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. It was Henderson who said the thing she would remember longest late in the afternoon, when the celebration was winding down, and she was standing with a cup of coffee, watching Cole laugh at something one of the ranch hands had said. Henderson came to stand beside her. He looked at Cole too for a moment. "You know what this town said when you came off that train?" he said. "I know," she said. "I was one of the ones saying it." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand now what I was wrong about. It wasn't just that I was wrong about you." He looked at her. "I was wrong about what a woman could be out here, what she could build, what she could do." He paused. "You changed my mind about that. And I don't say that lightly because my mind doesn't change easily." She looked at him. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "Tom," he said. "I think you've earned Tom by now." She smiled. "Thank you, Tom." He nodded and moved away, and she stood there with her coffee and her fiddle music and the long Nevada afternoon stretching gold and warm around her, and she thought this. This is what I came for. Not any specific thing, not the ranch, not the channel, not the lending library, or the arithmetic students, or the ledgers, or the court hearing, or any single piece of it. This feeling. This specific and irreplaceable feeling of standing in the middle of your own life and knowing without doubt that every hard thing you did to get here was worth doing. Cole found her there a few minutes later. He stood beside her. Close, but not touching, still giving her room even now, even on the day they were married, because that was simply who he was, and she understood by now that it was not distance. It was respect. The two things that looked identical from the outside and felt completely different from the inside. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she said, and then, because it was more accurate, better than good. She looked up at him. "How are you?" "Best day I've had in a long time," he said simply. She leaned into him then, just slightly, her shoulder against his arm, her weight shifting fractionally toward him. It was a small thing. It was for Abigail Harper an enormous thing. He didn't make a performance of it. He just shifted slightly to accommodate her, easy and natural, like something that had always been true. "Cole," she said. "Yeah. I want to tell you something." "All right." "I've been keeping accounts," she said, "in my head, since August." She felt him look at her. "Keeping track of every time you did something decent, every time you didn't push, every time you gave me room instead of taking it." She paused. "It was a reflex. I couldn't help it. When you've lived the way I lived, you learn to document every kindness because you assume the invoice is coming." He was quiet. "The invoice never came," she said. "And somewhere around December, I stopped keeping the accounts." She looked up at him. "I didn't notice right away. But that was when it happened. That was when I started trusting you. Not because you proved yourself. Because I stopped waiting for you to fail." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's the bravest thing you've ever told me," he said. "I've told you a lot of brave things. This one's different." He looked down at her. "You trusted yourself. That's the part that matters." She held his gaze. And she felt it, the full, complete, unhesitating truth of what she had built, and where she stood, and who she was. Not the frightened girl from the train platform, not the daughter from Boston, not the mail-order bride the town had whispered about. Herself. Just exactly, completely, irrevocably, herself. Years from now, Red Canyon would tell the story, the way small towns tell the stories that matter to them imperfectly, with embellishment missing some details and exaggerating others, but always with the essential shape of it intact. The mail-order bride who came off the train looking like a lost girl. The cowboy who gave her a locked room and waited. The fraud she uncovered, the channel she designed, the land claim. She helped defeat the father. She faced down the library. She built the children. She taught the woman she became. They would tell it to their daughters and their granddaughters, the women of Red Canyon, as a particular kind of story, not the kind where a man rescues a woman, but the kind where a woman rescues herself, and a man is wise enough to stand beside her while she does it. The ranch grew. The channel held through every winter after that first one. The lending library expanded twice and was eventually funded by the county. The arithmetic students grew up, and some of them went to university, and a few of them came back to teach the next generation of children who squirmed and resisted, and eventually grudgingly learned their multiplication tables. Abigail opened a formal bookkeeping practice, one of the first in the county run by a woman, though that distinction mattered less and less as the years went on, and the practice became simply known for being the most accurate and the most trusted. Cole ran the ranch and expanded it carefully, never faster than the land could support, with the particular patience he brought to everything that mattered. They had arguments because they were two strong-minded, opinionated people who had both spent their lives making hard decisions and were not going to stop having opinions just because they loved each other. The arguments were honest and direct, and usually resolved by whoever made the better case, rather than whoever held the position longer, which was the only fair way, and which they had both figured out independently and then confirmed together. They had good years and difficult years, because that was the nature of land and love and time. They had each other, which was the thing that made the difficult years navigable and the good years extraordinary. When couples came to them for advice, and eventually as the years passed, they did because the story had made them into something like a legend in the valley, Cole always gave the same answer. He said, Love isn't about finding someone who's ready for you. It's about being patient enough to let each other become ready. It's about giving someone the key to the room and meaning it when you say you don't have a copy. And Abigail, who had spent 22 years in one kind of life, and built herself an entirely different one from the ground up with her own 2 hands and her own stubborn, brilliant, unbreakable mind, would add, and it's about understanding that choosing to stay is the only kind of staying that matters. Every single day. You choose it again. That was the thing that had taken her the longest to learn, and that she had never from the day she finally learned it once forgotten. She had come to Red Canyon, Nevada in the summer of 1888 with 1 suitcase and no expectations, and a heart so defended it had almost forgotten how to want anything. She had left that version of herself on the train platform, though she hadn't known it at the time. What she had built in its place, what she had chosen piece by piece, day by day, in full possession of her own freedom and her own future, was something no one could take, no one could claim, no one could file a legal challenge against or threaten away or purchase with a Boston banker's money. It was hers. Completely, permanently, triumphantly hers. And that made all the difference in the world.